Barrowland Ballroom. In 1888, Margaret Russell married James McIver. They both worked in their fruit shop in Bridgeton, Glasgow. Through their hard work, they were able to expand their business to hire out barrows to local hawkers, which were sellers. Their efforts were important to street vendors who depended on this income to support their families, many of these traders being largely women, and as World War I grew closer, street traders were constantly being moved on from the city centre streets. By 1921, Maggie and James had bought land and opened it up to the traders. The market grew into a large open-air market the locals fondly called the Barrows. Eventually, Maggie saw the need for a covered area so that traders could continue to work, protected from weather conditions. So in 1926, the whole area was covered, allowing traders to continue working.
Why do they call you the Barrow's Queen?
Well, the only explanation I can give is because we were hiring barrows.
Because you were hiring barrows?
Before we took over the market.
Oh, why? Uh-huh.
And had hundreds of barrows.
But you've got no barrows now, have you?
No. But one for their own use.
Oh, yes. Now, how old are your barrows? I mean, at the market?
This place here, well, wait till I see, well, it'll be 29 years anyhow.
Uh-huh. And if it's not a rude question, how old are you?
I'm 75, as sweet as a nut.
That's good.
I'm as good as 25. I'm a hard nut to crack.
After the death of her husband in 1930 from malaria, Maggie continued to work, and in 1934 she opened the Barrowland Ballroom as a venue for social events and dances for local traders and their families. The ballroom became very popular and saw many musicians from all genres perform there over the years. Obviously, there were other dance halls in Glasgow that were also very popular, like the Majestic Ballroom on Hope Street and the Locarno, created in 1926 on Sauchiehall Street. After Maggie's death in 1958, her son took over. A few months later, the ballroom was gutted by fire. But from out of the ashes grew a new Barrowlands, and by Christmas 1960 it was once again standing proud where Maggie and James had first started their venture. Unfortunately, by the late 1960s, Glasgow was becoming known for its rough streets and strong gang presence, making it one of the most violent cities in Britain. Although attempts were made to improve things, many cases remained unsolved. February 1968 in Glasgow, Scotland was extremely cold. A dark presence was on the horizon, threatening to cast a shadow over the streets and dampen the spirit of the Barrowland Ballroom. It was presumed that an unknown individual was seen by many as one of the most sinister and frightening criminals to ever evade justice. 3 individual murders were committed from the freezing cold of February 1968 to the horror of October the 31st, 1969. 67-year-old Maurice Goodman bundled up against the cold before heading to his garage in Carmichael Lane Battlefield, an unlit lane that sits between 2 rows of terraced houses. There were no streetlights back there, and back then definitely no security lights. There were lockups and garages, some sheds, but not much else. At 7:30 a.m. on Friday morning, February the 23rd, 1968, Maurice Goodman noticed a figure lying on the ground in front of the garage doors. At first he thought the person might have had too much to drink, but he thought it odd that they were naked when it was so cold. He nudged the naked body to check for any response, and it seemed still. Suddenly realising the seriousness of the situation, he hurried back to call the police. He was told to return to the scene and wait for the police to arrive. At first there was a lack of urgency, but that would soon change when detectives D.S. Andrew Johnston and DC Norman MacDonald arrived on the scene. It would be discovered as the detectives moved in closer to the body that it was a female and not a male, as was first thought. A still shaken Morris was asked to stand guard at one end of Carmichael Lane as the two detectives looked over the scene. They noted the absence of clothing except a pair of slingback heeled shoes discarded some distance away and a used sanitary tampon. When looking over the small female body on the frozen ground, they could see cuts and bruising over her face, and then the unmistakable marks on her neck where she had been strangled. An hour later the whole area was sealed off with the instructions to keep the scene intact. The CID were called in and Detective Superintendent Elphinstone Dalgleish was informed of the murder. Dalglish's first step was to set up a tent to shield the remains, and a police caravan was set up on Leadard Road to facilitate communication between the police and the public. Dr. James Imrie, the police surgeon, conducted a quick examination of the body and suggested that strangulation was likely the cause of death. At that moment, the estimated time of death was believed to be within the last few hours. The woman's clothes were missing, except for her shoe and a sanitary tampon left near the scene, indicating she'd been menstruating at the time. She wore a plain gold wedding ring on her third finger of her right hand. More and more uniformed officers were present, and with all the police activity came the media. Journalists and photographers swooped into the area and began knocking on doors, hoping for some information from those in the neighbourhood. Much to their annoyance, the journalists got to the neighbours before the police, who eventually had to intervene so they could carry out their inquiries. It soon became clear that no one had seen or heard anything about the poor unfortunate woman found dead in the lane. There had been no reports of disturbances to the police, meaning whatever had occurred had unfolded quietly, deathly quietly. The unknown body lay in the cold as the police searched for clues to identify her. It would also come to light in later years that the police had thought the woman may have been killed elsewhere and dumped in the lane, as there didn't seem to be any signs of a scuffle of any sort in the lane. It was possible a car could easily go down it and quietly dump the body where it was found. And yet the police report noted that some bloodstains were discovered on the wall near where Patricia's body was found. They were just small droplets, but they were there. The police caravan had some visitors who hoped to assist. An ambulance driver who said he was from the area suggested she might be a nurse, but he wasn't certain and couldn't provide a name. It would be hours later before the woman's body was finally removed from the lane, and a post-mortem was carried out by Professor Gilbert Forbes and Dr. James Imrie. It was confirmed she was killed by strangulation, but the ligature was missing from the scene. She had been violated, but she had been brutally beaten all over her entire body. With no clues or witnesses, the frustrated police expanded house-to-house inquiries, but they were struggling. It was a waiting game, just waiting for someone to come forward. A possible first breakthrough. While detectives did house to house, they came across a local school teacher who claimed that in the early hours of that morning she heard a woman shout twice, "Let me go! Let me go!" She noted that the outcry was brief and there were no screams afterwards. She expressed sadness for not taking it more seriously at the time, but she claimed she couldn't make it out if the cries were cries of distress. While this information didn't clarify who the woman was, it could, possibly, if it was Patricia, shed light on where she was killed. It was now decided to give a full description of the woman to the Glasgow Evening Times. that ran with the headline, "Murder in City Lane, girl believed nude and strangled." It continued, "Unidentified dead woman, medium height, short dark brown wavy hair, hazel eyes, a snub nose and a wedding ring on her third finger of her right hand." They appealed for anyone with any information to come forward. At 29 Langside Place, Battlefield, just a short walk away from the crime scene, Mr. and Mrs. John and Pauline Wilson had been worrying about their daughter Patricia, who had gone out the previous night with her fellow nursing friends, but hadn't returned home. Patricia and her 4-year-old son had been living with her parents since she had returned home from Cyprus in May 1967. She had separated from her husband, Corporal Alex Docker, who at the time of their separation was stationed in Cyprus while serving in the RAF. He had since returned to the UK and was stationed at RAF Digby in Lincolnshire. They were worried when a neighbour had called round to tell them about the incident that had happened in the lane. However, it wasn't until John Wilson saw the newspaper that his concern turned to fear. Though he didn't want to believe it could be his beloved daughter, he knew it was a possibility. After a heartfelt talk with his wife, he made his way to the Leddard Road incident caravan with a photograph of his daughter in his pocket. The injuries to the woman's features were too bad that they couldn't go by the photograph provided by Mr. Wilson, so they asked him to accompany them to the morgue to make a formal identification. Mr. John Wilson stood as they slowly drew back the sheet that covered her body. As the sheet revealed the upper body, John Wilson collapsed to the floor and cried in pain as he recognised his only daughter, 25-year-old Patricia Jane Charlotte Docker, née Wilson. We learn a bit about Patricia. Patricia was 19 when she married Alexander Docker, a senior aircraft man with the RAF. They had a son, Sandy. The family lived together in Cyprus, where Alex's unit was based. But the Dockers' marriage was in trouble and the couple separated. In April 1967, Pat returned to Glasgow, where she became an auxiliary nurse, working nights and splitting her shifts and taking care of her 4-year-old son, Sandy, with her mother. She was a hard-working nurse who worked night shifts with just a couple of nights a week off. Her mother also worked in the same hospital as her. She enjoyed dancing and often went with her friends, when she could, to the Barrowland's ballroom, the Locarno or the Majestic ballroom. That evening her parents believed she had gone to the Majestic ballroom with her friends, leaving at around 8:30 p.m. She had worn a yellowish coloured woolen dress, a grey coat with blue fur collar, and a brown slingback shoes. She wore her grandmother's wedding ring on her right-hand finger and had a brown handbag. As usual, the initial focus was on the estranged husband, Corporal Docker, who would be the first to be interviewed. Although he was in Lincolnshire, the detectives discovered he was on leave at the time Patricia's life was viciously taken, so they invited him to come to Glasgow. Alex Docker proved his innocence by producing many witnesses to his whereabouts at the time Patricia's life was brutally taken. An appeal went out for anyone who was at the Majestic ballroom that night who may have seen Patricia with someone. They stated any information could be useful and to come forward and would be treated with the strictest confidence. The appeal was an open appeal for anyone who saw anything suspicious. In fact, they wanted to talk to all that attended the Majestic that night. The head of Glasgow CID at the time was the well-respected and highly regarded Detective Chief Superintendent Tom Goodall. He assessed the information they had collected so far and gave orders for more resources to be made available to the lead officer on the case, Superintendent Dalgleish. A team of officers was sent out to search for Patricia's clothes that were still missing. They looked through yards, bins, garages, under discarded rubbish. 4 police divers spent 5 hours poking the freezing cold waters of the river White Cart water with large sticks. They used the press to their advantage, giving them just a snippet of information that made it seem as if they had possibly found some interesting major evidence. Detectives became more prominent in the clubs and bars of Glasgow. Apparently, they wanted the killer to feel unnerved by not only the news, but by the police presence. The determination to catch this evil killer by Detective Chief Superintendent Tom Goodall and the lead officer of the case, Superintendent Dalgleish, was apparent to all. It's believed the significant find was part of Patricia's watch case, a bracelet and a handbag. Did that help? Well, no, not really. They waited. Surely something should come from all of this attention. But any feedback wasn't forthcoming. Goodall made another appeal to the press, giving a full and precise description of the missing clothes. Not just colours, not just styles, but every detail possible, and what the material of each item was. Dalgleish encouraged people through the press to be vigilant and keep looking for Patricia's clothing, as they could be anywhere in Glasgow. They continued interviewing taxi drivers, bus drivers, dance hall workers and bar workers. As thorough as they were, they still drew a blank. A week had passed and the police had concentrated mostly on the dance halls, with the Majestic being at the centre of the investigation, as that was the place they'd been told Patricia had visited that night. A male had also come forward claiming he had danced with her that night at the Majestic. It was over 25 nights, or as these nights became known as Grab a Granny Night, and a busy night of around 100 to 200 patrons, with 40 detectives weaving their way through the crowd, asking questions and showing Patricia's photo. A detective spoke to patrons asking for assistance, and a blow-up photo of Patricia was shown on the ballroom screen. This seemed to work. Someone mentioned that they believed Patricia had attended the Barrowland ballroom that night, not the Majestic. This was new. The police went over all the evidence again and realised through witnesses at the Barrowland that she had been there at the Barrowland ballroom and had been seen dancing with at least 3 men. The only thing that could be remembered about one of the men was that he had light reddish hair, which wasn't unusual for Glasgow. The police now realised that the killer might have chosen his victim at the Barrowland, just 4 miles away from where her body was discovered. It became clear to the police that they had lost valuable time canvassing the Majestic, more so when the witness who initially claimed to have seen Patricia at the Majestic that night changed his story, admitting he had confused the night with another. The Daily Record newspaper printed over 1,000 posters of Patricia and had them distributed around Glasgow. They gave details of how people could get in touch with the police if they had any information that could help them. The press went hard with this story, so hard that many people in Glasgow became fearful that police couldn't catch this person. Unfortunately, there's not much more to tell. Apart from false leads that had to be investigated, Patricia's case went cold. Patricia's son went to live with his father and had a happy childhood. But sadly, Patricia's father passed away not long after his daughter, and her mother not long after that. As Patricia Docker's case slipped from the news, attention shifted to several other unrelated murder cases in Glasgow. People felt uneasy, haunted by the thought that a killer or killers were among them, hiding in plain sight. Unfortunately, it was a disturbing reality. After a while, the team of detectives working on the case were trimmed down, allowing detectives to focus on rising cases that also needed their attention. Over the years, some retired detectives and officers said the case faced problems from the beginning. Many believed that without eyewitnesses stepping forward or a confession, they wouldn't uncover who was behind it. As I mentioned earlier, violent crime increased in Glasgow by the late 60s, and following Patricia's case, the number of violent incidents rose. Jemima MacDonald. Jemima was born in 1937, and by 1969, at 31 years old, she was a single mother to 3 children. Elizabeth, who was 11, Andrew 8, and Alan 7. Standing at 5 feet 7 inches tall, she was an attractive woman with beautiful dark wavy hair that reached her shoulders. Those close to her lovingly called her Mima. Her family adored her. She was a devoted mother who always prioritised her children. Despite their small flat, she ensured it was clean and her kids were well fed and cared for. Unfortunately, some of the men that had come into her life hadn't treated her well. There had been violence in the relationships, leaving her hurt both physically and emotionally. But she held on to the hope that the ideal man was still out there. Most of Mima's friends or family were married or in long-term relationships, so she often went out dancing alone. Being the friendly social butterfly she was, it didn't take her long for her to attach to someone, either male or female, for friendly companionship. Her sister lived in the same building as her, so when she went out, her sister watched the children. They didn't live in the best part of Glasgow. 1960s Bridgeton was rough and tough, but Jemima liked it there, and she got on well with the community, who also had to survive the rough and tough streets of Glasgow at the time. On Saturday the 16th of August, Jemima spent some time getting herself ready for a night of dancing at the Barrowland ballroom, with, it's believed, a mystery man she'd met. This man, by all accounts, was a handsome man, smartly dressed and well groomed, but for reasons only Jemima knew, she hadn't said much about him to anyone. After feeding her children, she continued to finish dressing into a bra. She wore 2 pairs of pants, a pair of stocking tights, frilly white blouse, and her favourite black pinafore dress with cream slingback high-heeled shoes. Once ready, she put on her brown belted woolen coat and took her children to her sister's. Before she left, she adjusted her hair, which was wrapped in a scarf to hold the curlers in place. She planned to take the curlers out once she reached the ladies' room in the Barrowland ballroom. Then she grabbed her black patent bag, said goodbye to her children and left. What's known about Jemima's movements that night? Well, it's known she walked a half-mile towards Barrowlands. She bought some chips, and she might have stopped off for a drink at a busy Betty's bar, which was across from the ballroom. It was claimed later that she was seen talking to a good-looking man before going into the ballroom. She was also seen dancing at around 11 p.m. inside the Barrowlands with a fair, red-headed, tall man who was well-dressed and around the age of 30. Witnesses would later say they saw her later when going home with someone that seemed to fit that description. The next morning, Sunday, Jemima's sister Margaret knocked on her door. When there was no answer, she assumed Jemima was still asleep and decided to try again later. But when she tried again later and still got no response, concern started to set in. This wasn't typical behaviour for Jemima. She wouldn't have stayed out all night, at least not without letting her sister know. Margaret was now worried, but decided to wait until the next morning. She's bound to be home by then, she thought. Unfortunately, Margaret still couldn't get a response from Jemima on Monday morning. Determined to get answers, she spoke to some of her sister's neighbours, who she knew to be regulars at the Barrowland, hoping that they might have seen her or heard something of Jemima, but they couldn't help. As she stepped outside, she heard a group of young people chatting excitedly about a woman some kids had found in an old building on McKeith Street. Margaret asked them where they had seen the woman and immediately rushed to the scene. When Margaret arrived, There was a crowd already gathering. She forced her way through and was met with the horrific sight of her sister's battered body laying on the dirt-covered floor in the back room. Margaret's cries of anguish echoed through the empty, abandoned, derelict building and onto the street. It later came to light that a group of kids playing there mistakenly thought they had found a homeless person sleeping, something they often saw, but it was unusual for it to be a woman. As an adult, one of the children would recall what he had seen. He said, "At first I thought it wasn't a real person. It looked like some sort of tailor's dummy. It was only when someone said it was a woman and she was bleeding on her face that we realised something was different. When I saw the body, the woman was laid face down. She had some of her clothes pulled up and some were torn and ripped. Her head was facing to one side and her hair was covering part of it. I remember thinking, she looked like she was sleeping." McKee Street was cordoned off and the scene was secured by Detective Chief Superintendent Tom Goodall, Superintendent Dalgleish and Superintendent James Binney. Post-mortem report revealed that Jemima was found with her head face down with her coat pulled halfway down her back and gathered up round her waist, as was her dress skirt. Her shoes were off and her stocking tights removed and torn. Her handbag was missing. The back of her pants were dirty. She had been punched in the face and death was caused by strangulation, probably caused by the stocking tights. Tufts of hair had been pulled from her head and were on her left of her clothing. It would appear that the perpetrator had attempted to violate her, but when realising she was menstruating at the time, had become incensed and strangled her. Her 2 pairs of pants were undisturbed. During the investigation, minor similarities to the Patricia Docker case were observed, but not thought to have been linked straight away. Notably, the victim was menstruating at the time of death, which was estimated to have occurred approximately 30 hours prior. This was supported by witness accounts from the children who had last seen her laying in the building the previous day. The time of death was determined to have occurred in the early hours of Sunday morning, August the 17th, but unlike Patricia Docker, Jemima was found clothed. They also noted her curlers and handbag were missing, another similarity to Patricia. House-to-house inquiries were once again carried out and once again came to nothing. Only one witness thought he saw Jemima talking to a man outside 23 McKee Street around 12:40 a.m. on the Sunday. The police decided to ask for help from a number of dustmen to go through all the waste, the debris and the rubbish on wasteland next to 23 McKee Street, where they concentrated on finding Jemima's handbag, purse and curlers, but after extensive searching, nothing was found. After Margaret O'Brien, Jemima's sister, had given her statement to the police, Jemima's 3 children were taken away from the family. The Barrowlands once again became the centre of attention when there were no new updates from McKee Street. The police took control of the ballroom and used the microphone to speak to the crowd. They shared the tragic news of Jemima MacDonald's death and urged anyone with even the smallest piece of information to come forward and assist with their investigation. They wanted anyone who may have seen her walk the short distance to McKee Street in the direction of Bridgeton Cross between the hours of 12:30 and 1:30 a.m. on the night in question to come forward. Finally, 2 people came forward, a young man and a young woman. Both gave a similar description of a young man thought to be aged between 25 and 35, around 6 foot tall and of slim build. He had reddish light hair and a pale complexion. He wore a nice, stylish, quality-made blue suit and a white shirt and a tie. DCS Tom Goodall committed himself to the investigation and coordinated the efforts with his superintendents, who were actively working on the scene. Goodall spoke with the press and told them of the man seen in company with Mima in the Barrowland ballroom and later in Bain Street. At around 12:15 a.m. on Sunday the 17th of August, the couple had been seen in London Road at the junction with Abercrombie Street. The police then held a reconstruction, such as they were back then, where a policewoman dressed in similar clothing to Jemima retraced the steps Jemima would have taken that night, but nothing came of this. Although there were obvious similarities to Patricia Docker's case, the police failed to make a connection at first, but a heck of a lot of Glaswegians believed the two were definitely linked. It wasn't until August 21st, 1969, that the police announced they were closely investigating both cases. DCS Tom Goodall shared this information with the press. He also requested that any male friends of Jemima's who might have been with her at the Barrowlands ballroom to come forward, and noted that they were still searching for her handbag and its contents. The most obvious connection between the two women was the Barrowlands ballroom and the fact that both of their handbags had been taken. The police were once again searching for a monster hiding in the shadows, blending into the crowd at the Barrowlands, and once again they had very few leads to follow. Tom Goodall felt his frustration rise. He knew a dangerous man was out there roaming the streets and poised to strike again, but this time he had a description. But tragedy struck the Glasgow force when at the age of just 58 Tom Goodall suffered a massive heart attack and died while at home on Sunday the 12th of October 1969. A huge blow to not only his family but the Glasgow City Police Department. Elphinstone Dalgleish was promoted to Detective Chief Superintendent. Unfortunately, by this time, the investigation into Jemima MacDonald's murder had more or less dried up. Fewer and fewer people were willing to take to the dance floor at the Barrowlands ballroom, and the bars and clubs of Gallowgate also suffered. People were scared of this man lurking in the shadows. Jemima's family refused to give up. 2 months after Jemima's murder, Jean Thomas, Jemima's oldest sister, reached out to the Scottish newspapers to offer a £100 reward for information that could lead to her sister's killer. Jemima's siblings had pulled together their resources to help towards the reward. Jean admitted their fear of potential retaliation from whoever was responsible for Jemima's death, but hoped it would help save the life of another poor woman. As time passed, it became apparent the £100 wasn't going to be claimed. The relationship between the police and the residents of Bridgeton and nearby areas was already strained, but now it was even more fragile. While the community remembered Jemima, they sensed that the police had largely lost sight of their purpose. Tensions were rising on both sides, and there seemed to be no resolution in sight. Those that knew Jemima knew her as a lovely, happy lady who didn't deserve what she got. To this day she is remembered fondly and with love, and the man that did this is still feared, despised and unknown. At this point I want to mention some extracts from Jean Langford's statements regarding her sister, who was the last victim believed to have been killed by the man who became known as Bible John, Helen Puttock. These come from a transcript of an insightful podcast by Audrey Gillan, who interviewed Jean in 1993 and later spoke with her family after Jean had passed away. Gillan had revisited the case for a podcast. Many other authors have also written extensively about the mystery, and it seems that the story evolves, at least to some extent. This includes police records as well. We have to consider whether we can trust what we've been told, and we're always being told to stick to the facts. It's the facts that matter, and it would seem Audrey Gillan, in my view, absolutely got as close to the facts as anyone outside of those with the authority could. Of course, that's just my own opinion. There are many theories out there of who Bible John could be and what happened where and when. Helen Puttock. Helen Gowan met serviceman George Puttock and they got married soon after. Helen then moved to Wokingham in Surrey, which was George's hometown. George was stationed in West Germany, but Helen found it difficult to settle. She wasn't happy. The army housing wasn't the most private, and friendships with other army wives wasn't always nice. George was away on manoeuvres most of the time, and Helen grew to hate where she was staying. By now the couple had 2 very young children, and Helen missed her family back home in Glasgow. She desperately wanted to go home. It would become apparent that they were having some marital problems, and although George was disappointed Helen wanted to leave, he agreed it would be for the best for her and the children. So 29-year-old Helen returned home and could be found living in Scotstoun, northwest of Glasgow city centre, with her mother and 2 young children, David 5 and Michael 1. When George came home after 6 months, he visited with his mother for a few days before going to Glasgow to see his family. On Thursday, 30th of October 1969, while George was home, Helen announced she was going dancing with her sister Jean. Apparently George wasn't very happy, but Helen was adamant that she was with her sister and friends and her plans were not going to change. That night Helen was dressed in green pants, brown tights, blue and black underskirt, black sleeveless dress, fake ocelot fur coat and black strapped heeled shoes. She carried a red leather purse. Helen's friend and sister Jean arrived at Helen's home, and George gave Jean the taxi fare to make sure they got home safely. They left at 8:30 p.m. and caught the bus to Glasgow Cross. Like usual, they stopped at the Traders Tavern. Jean mentioned they didn't have much money, just enough for 2 whiskies, the ticket to the ballroom and a taxi home. Since the Barrowlands didn't serve alcohol, most people headed to the bars before going to the dance. They enjoyed a drink and some conversation before making their way to the Barrowland ballroom. There seemed to be a lack of concern just lately among the dancers in the ballroom, even though it had only been about 18 months since the Barrowlands was at the heart of the criminal investigations regarding the brutal deaths of 2 women by a man who was still on the loose. Jean got onto the dance floor but kept a close eye on her sister, who after a while started to dance and was joined by a tall, handsome-looking man. Jean also found herself paired with a friendly man who was enjoying the dancing. This man would be referred to throughout this case as Castle Milk John, referring to the area he claimed he was from. Occasionally the 4 would connect, and it was discovered that both men's Christian names were allegedly John. Jean laughed when she recalled the man dancing with her sister had said his name was also John. Jean mentioned at the end of the evening she and Helen went to collect their coats and visited the ladies' toilets, leaving the 2 men together. Jean said to her sister while in there, "Come on, we'll go and get a taxi." And her sister had replied, "It's all right, we don't have to pay. He's going to pay for it." "Good," Jean replied. In the foyer, Jean went to buy a packet of cigarettes from the vending machine. She inserted her money, but the cigarettes didn't come out. They shook the compartment at the bottom, but it was without success. Jean and Helen made a fuss because Jean had lost money she couldn't afford to lose. The manager and some staff noticed and came over. Then John, who had been dancing with Helen, also came over. Both he and the manager, who, according to Jean, was a tough-looking guy who took no messing, started to argue. Jean said he was being very assertive, but she thought it odd that the manager took the verbal attack the guy threw at him. She felt the manager seemed hesitant to engage, as if he wanted to avoid the situation with this man. Jean was told to come back the next day for a refund, as the cash machines were now locked. John angrily explained that it wasn't right for Jean to lose her money, and that his father had always said places like these were dens of iniquity, or something like that, Jean recalled. Leaving the ballroom, the four of them left together with all the others and walked towards Gallowgate, reaching Weir Street, where Jean's John said good night, as he was going to catch a bus to Castlemilk, and he left the group. The curious conversation in the taxi. The remaining three-quarter taxi at Glasgow crossed to Scotstoun, but John seemed agitated at Jean's presence, like she was in the way. It didn't help that the taxi driver, Alex Hannah, didn't seem to know where he was going and had to ask for help with directions. There was one incident Jean clearly recalled in the taxi. John knew she smoked, yet he took out a pack of cigarettes and offered one to Helen, without extending the same courtesy to Jean. Curious, she asked him why he hadn't offered her a cigarette. He remained silent. Frustrated, she took his hand, grabbed the pack and slipped a few cigarettes into her bag. She explained that she only did it because he should have offered her a smoke earlier, but chose not to. Jean began to ask him questions about himself, but he seemed reluctant to answer. She said it was like trying to draw blood from a stone. Both she and Helen asked him about his job, what he enjoyed doing, where he went on holiday, things along those lines. They asked him about football, and he responded with the curious quote that he was agnostic and claimed he had no interest in the game. Jean pointed out that they mentioned religion and football, which is commonly associated with certain Scottish football clubs. Jean also recalled he had said that he disapproved of married women who went to dance halls and spoke of adulterous women and quoted something from the Bible. Now the police, but mostly the press, made a huge deal of this, and the sensationalist headline was born: "The Bible John Killer." This was heavily emphasised by the police. The police record states he had not been drinking and told the woman that drinking was not allowed in his home. He said that he was an only child, but changed this during the journey and said he had a sister. He said she had come home drunk once and his father had refused her entry into the house. On reaching Earl Street, Helen wanted to get out, but the man said they would take Jean home first. When Helen remarked about the expense of the fare, the man said not to worry, he had plenty of money. The taxi was then driven to Kelso Street at Alderman Road, where Jean alighted. Jean goes on to say, "I knew Helen could look out for herself. I wasn't worried. I thought it was nice of him to take me up the road first. I told him to drop me off earlier, about a mile from home. But he said, 'No, we'll drop you at the door.' And I said, 'No, let me off at the roundabout.'" She continued, "I don't know, maybe it was intuition, but I didn't want him to know where I stayed." Once they dropped Jean off, the taxi went back, but when the driver reached Harland Street, he got confused. As I said before, the taxi driver wasn't sure about the directions, so stopped the taxi to ask his passengers for help to get to Earl's place where Helen lived. The police states The driver told them Helen had directed him to stop at a park about 10 yards beyond Earl's Place, which was just west of 95 Earl Street. According to the driver, one of the occupants asked what the fare was. It was £1.06. It appeared the man didn't have the money to pay, and the woman looked like she was looking in her purse for the money to pay, and then gave the man the money to pay the taxi. He leaned through the window and handed over the exact amount of cash. He apologised and offered some coppers, to which the driver said it was all right. Jean continued, "See, when they told me he didn't have the money, well, that was a surprise. He was a chancer." People wondered why he was with her going up the lane close to her home. What was the reason? Family and friends said that Helen didn't hook up. No one knows why he walked with her or what happened afterwards. Those following the Bible John cases have speculated that he might have mentioned living nearby to justify going in the same direction as her, or possibly having relatives close by. In the wee small hours on Friday morning the 31st, between the hours of 1 a.m. and 2 a.m, a dishevelled-looking man got on a bus that ran along Dumbarton Road. The only people on the bus were the driver, the conductor, and possibly another passenger. They all noticed how messed up the man was. He had dirt or mud all over his jacket. It was obvious that he was trying to hide his appearance, as he pulled at his sleeve trying to hide where a cufflink was missing. He also appeared to have a red mark, like a scratch on his face. It seemed clear to them he'd been in some sort of scuffle. It was a short journey. He got off the bus just before Channing Cross at the junction of Argyle Street and Derby Street. Beattie first thought the man may have used the nearby Govan ferry to cross the River Clyde to the south of the city, but the ferryman working that night couldn't remember a man of that description using the ferry. So it was looking as if he had disappeared into the night, never to be seen again. Or was he? Digging deeper, the 1996 team discovered an address on Berkeley Street. It's possible John McInnes knocked on the door of that flat because it was a place he knew well and had often stayed over if he missed his last bus home to Lanarkshire. It was the residence of William and Janet McInnes, his aunt and uncle. Helen Puttock's body was found the next morning in the back court of 95 Earl Street, Scotstoun, at 7:35 a.m. on Friday the 31st of October 1969 by Archibald McIntyre, who had been out exercising his dog in the back court and lived at that address. When he first saw Helen, all he could see was what he first thought was a bunch of rags. He ran to get a neighbour to call the police.
At 7:25 the next morning, a black Labrador dog being taken for an early morning walk by his owner found the body of Helen Puttock in this back court at 95 Errol Street. She had been beaten and strangled. She was lying face downwards at an angle to a wall, her clothes badly displaced. There were signs that at one stage she might have tried to escape from her attacker, run up that embankment and been dragged back.
2 uniformed police turned up and radioed for assistance from the Marine Police Office in Puttock. DCI Tom Valentine called in Superintendent Joe Beattie and Glasgow CID Chief Dalgleish. Helen's body was lying just a few doors away from her mother's flat. Police notes state, when Helen's body was found, it was in a face-down position, adjacent to the wall and at an angle from it. Her coat was partly covering her. The top part of her tights were missing, and parts of the stocking legs remained. Her knickers had been ripped off and torn, and parts of them were used as a ligature, tied in a wreath knot around her throat. Her bra had been torn in two and her underslip pushed under her breasts. The sanitary pad she had was found under her armpit. There were abrasions above the ligature, seemingly made by the deceased person in an attempt to loosen it. There were also abrasions to the jaw and side of the head, which were consistent with a punch or having her head hit against a hard object. There was bleeding from the mouth and nose. There were signs that Helen had managed to free herself for a moment and get herself a little way up the embankment. Her hairbrush that she kept in her pocket was found there. She had a scrape mark on the leg part of her tights. She appears to have been dragged across the grass court, as there was grass between the shoe and the heel. It would appear that she had been strangled while she was on her back and at the wall of the building. Her purse that contained around 10 shillings was missing. A cheap Woolworth-type cufflink was found at the side of her clothes, as well as a lipstick and gold chain. It was estimated that the time of her death was in the region of 1 a.m, but it could vary because of the cold temperature that night. Someone had rained down blows and kicks to this woman's face and body, and if this is true or just a rumour, a human bite mark was also discovered on her wrist. The detectives observed that the victim was dressed as if she were going out for the night, but there were no other clues to help identify her. Joe Beattie, being the senior officer, took charge of the investigation. Beattie was a formidable detective. He saw his fair share of terrible crimes, but Bible John would be the one case that would forever be attached to his name. He relied on his experience and his instincts, gained from years of working on the streets. Joe Beattie had a job to do, a killer to find, someone who was hiding somewhere in Glasgow. As usual, the mobile police caravan was put in place, this time on Earl Street, outside the front entrance of 95 tenement block. More officers were brought in to cover other access areas to the tenements. At the rear of the court, fingerprint experts and police photographers began their duties. Soil samples were taken, and the assistant chief medical officer pronounced Helen dead. Once again, house-to-house inquiries began, and the police swarmed the area. That morning, at 129 Earl Street, George Puttock looked out of his window and saw all the commotion in the street below. He described what had happened in an interview, saying, "The night before he'd stayed up late waiting for Helen to come home, but when it got late he had gone to sleep. He woke in the morning to see she still hadn't come home and began to get worried. He looked out of the front bedroom window where he saw a police van. He had a very bad feeling and went out towards the van. As he did, he heard someone comment that there was a girl and she had been murdered. At the caravan he spoke to a policeman who went to fetch Inspector Beattie. Beattie spoke gently to him and asked him what his wife had been wearing. George gave him a description of the clothes he had last seen her in. Beattie put his hand on George's shoulder and said, "I'm sorry, she's been murdered." The story goes that Joe Beattie and Detective Sergeant Ian McGill took George back to Helen's mother's flat, where he was questioned and checked for any scratch marks on his person, as was standard procedure, to rule him out as a suspect. Beattie apologised and explained to George why he had to do that. George told Beattie he had spoken to Jean early in the morning by phone and told him of the shared taxi home. Beattie needed to talk to Jean. Years later, the police acknowledged that the procedure had not been handled correctly. The husband of the deceased woman should have been taken to the station for formal questioning and a search. Jean Langford, Helen's sister, had learned of her sister's death shortly after George received the news. Jean was overwhelmed with grief. She couldn't speak. She was absolutely, totally devastated. So it would be a little while before the police could get a statement from her. Jean would become the most important witness, according to Beattie. Beattie knew what she had to say was important. She had been face to face with this man, spoke to him, and could hopefully give a good description of him. Yes, she definitely was important. Once again, the Barrowland's ballroom was in the spotlight. On November the 1st, 1969, the police reached out to the public who had attended the ballroom that evening for any information about the man who had been seen with Helen Puttock on the night of Thursday the 30th. Between Friday the 31st and Saturday night, 1st of November, around 865 patrons were interviewed. On Sunday the 2nd of November, Alexander Hanna, the taxi driver, had read about Helen's murder in the paper and went straight to the police. Beattie had the taxi fingerprinted straight away. And what a farce that was, but I'll come back to that. Because Jean and Helen had friends who went to the Barrowlands and other people who knew them from the ballroom and the pub and had seen them both that night, people did come forward. A decent description could be built up from not only Jean's details, but from a few others, Jean's being the more detailed. They were looking for a male between 25 to 30 years of age, 5'10" to 6 feet tall, medium build, light auburn to reddish hair, styled short and brushed to the right. The man has straight teeth, with one tooth on the upper right overlapping the next tooth. A request was made to the Deputy Director of the Glasgow School of Art, G.W. Lennox Patterson, if he would agree to draw a picture using the witness's description. He agreed and the new picture was made. The picture was distributed to all the news media. The picture was in colour and was also taken to the Barrowlands ballroom and projected onto the big screen while the dance hall was open. Posters were hung in every newsagent and police station. Beattie and his team went to work with little time for relaxation, even less for sleep. They hit the streets of Glasgow, exploring the gritty back alleys and bars, trying to blend in among the night owls. It was expected that all the men in the Earl Street tenement blocks were to be questioned, and as far as they knew, 95% of the Barrowland ballroom males were questioned, but not every male from that evening could be identified, and Bible John still went unidentified. The other John, who Jean had danced with and who they started calling Castle Milk John, didn't respond when police asked him to get in touch. Beattie emphasised that the man wasn't in any trouble, they just wanted to speak with him, assuring him that all information would remain confidential and that he could come forward with his dignity intact. Castle Milk John could have provided useful details as he had interacted with the other John and might have helped towards the description Jean had already given. He mentioned working as a roofer, so the police reached out to roofing and construction firms in the Castle Milk area. However, for some reason, Castle Milk John chose not to come forward. Jean was an excellent witness and never once wavered from a statement. With Joe Beattie's help, she went over that night. She remembered the way he moved and the way he acted. She recalled everything from his overlapping teeth to his stylish clothing. His suit had been described as new and smart, so all tailors were questioned. His hair smart and well groomed, so all barbers were interviewed. Over 450 hairdressers in and around Glasgow were shown the drawing of the suspect. And let's not forget the dentist. All dentists in and around Glasgow were asked to examine their records to determine whether they held records of a male patient with overlapping incisors and a missing tooth in the upper right jaw. Detective Robert Johnston put the idea of hypnotism into the mind of Beattie, not expecting him to take him seriously. But Beattie thought it might be a good idea to see if it could unlock any forgotten memories. They found a qualified, reputable doctor, but the Crown Office stated they would not accept any evidence from hypnosis in court. They did go ahead, and Jean did remember the suspect had mentioned a cousin had once got a hole in one playing golf while under hypnosis. And yes, they followed this up by checking all golf clubs, and according to Johnston, she also remembered he had mentioned that the Bible says women who go out without their husbands were stoned to death. The media frenzy and drip-fed feed Joe Beattie's expertise at spin. A press conference was held to reveal some details about Helen Puttock's death. A curious crowd gathered to listen to what they had to say. While the police shared several details, one particular comment resonated. It became the headline the press saw and introduced a name that instilled fear across the entire city. At the press release, they said, "He was quite well spoken with a Glasgow accent, around 25 to 30 years old, light auburn reddish hair brushed to the right. He might have marks to his face of a recent origin. The suspect may have overlapping teeth and smokes embassy cigarettes. He may have had a strict religious upbringing and may have reference to the Bible. It is thought that his Christian name may be John." If anything was going to sell news, it was sensationalism. One journalist for the Evening Times ran to phone in his report to his editor, and armed with the police statement that the perpetrator of these crimes had quoted from the Bible and that they believed the man's name is thought to be John, he said, "Let's call him Bible John." In June 1970, police used the newly developed PhotoFit system to create a clearer image of the murder suspect. This was the first time this identification method was utilised in Scotland. After receiving approval, the police shared the image with all media outlets. The new PhotoFit caused quite a stir in the city. People flooded to the police with reports of sightings. This reaction was understandable, as posters were everywhere, in shops, on the lampposts, and even in libraries and post offices. The PhotoFit was featured in newspapers and on all TV news programmes. Also in 1970, reports came in regarding psychic Gerard Croiset. The Scottish newspaper, the Daily Record, brought him over to help with the case. He started sketching a location on a map where he thought the killer might live. The newspaper then provided a document with details and a map indicating where the killer could potentially be found. A search followed, and a few possible suspects were questioned. Ultimately, this effort led to no significant results. Croiset was very popular among the paranormal psychic world and often came over to the UK from the Netherlands. The press loved him. Did Gerard Croiset identify Bible John? No, he didn't. And Joe Beattie, it was claimed, was glad to see the back of him. Not because of the man himself, because, as Joe said himself, he was a pleasant man and he liked him. But all the misinformation had to be looked into, and it wasted even more of their time. Some doubts had started to creep in. Even if they could find this man, could Jean definitely pick him out of an identity parade? Jean was accompanied by 2 female police officers, and she was exhausted from regular trips to the ballrooms, looking to see if the man was stupid enough to show his face, while the detectives stayed undercover looking for any man who fit the description every Thursday and weekends. Jean Langford was the chief witness and wanted to help catch the killer of her sister. She had been to so many identity parades and saw so many suspects, hundreds of them, she said. But as the months passed, Joe Beattie hadn't moved any closer to catching this man. In 1970, Dr. Robert Britton, a psychiatrist, was asked to assist in creating a criminal profile of the person they were looking for.
The sadistic murderer is almost always male. The seeds of his abnormalities would seem to be planted at a very early age, and a careful history will often show clear evidence of some manifestations of his perversions even before puberty. He can be prim, proper, even prudish, avoiding profanities himself and condemning obscenity, vulgarity, or impropriety in others. He condemns sexual conversations and deplores blue snoring.
Beattie was intrigued by Dr. Britton's insight as he outlined the psychological traits of the man they believed they were after. Beattie now had a better picture of this man and formed his own view on who he was looking for. He claimed the man they were looking for possibly lived with a relative, but a bit of a loner, a good-looking man and personable. He may hold an authoritative role, albeit a small role. A man who likes to go out but doesn't know how to socialise. There are numerous psychological analyses of Bible John, so many that I chose not to delve too deeply into that aspect. Many professionals have written extensively on this aspect of this unknown person. The topic is complex and intense, and I wanted to focus on what was going on, well, as close as I can. After all, was it one man or more? It's only logical to me that they're looked at case by case. As I said, doubts had started to seep into the investigation, doubts that the police might be hiding something or not asking the right questions of some obvious witnesses. Some thought Beattie might be relying too heavily on Jean's account of that night. They believed there were other witnesses who could have provided more useful information at the Barrowlands. Joe Beattie ran the show, and his officers knew it. The area the police were focusing on was plagued with problems, and other areas required attention too. To make matters worse, 2 child serial offenders were on the loose at the time, and the police were eager to apprehend them. Local gangs ruled the streets, and Gallowgate's clubs and bars had become notorious hangouts for hardened criminals. The police were under pressure, and Bible John was nowhere to be found. On September 18th, 1970, a half-hour documentary was made by the BBC and appealed to the man known as Bible John to give himself up, and ended with the quote from Jeremiah chapter 23 verse 24, "Can any hide himself in secret places, that I shall not see him, saith the Lord?" It caught the public's attention and generated about 200 calls. It's been estimated that around thousands of statements were taken in the Bible John cases, and they had thousands of potential suspects. It was thought that Jean Langford was to have attended at least 200 to 300 ID parades. Also during this time, Jean Langford became Jean Williams at the police's suggestion. They wanted to ease her worry that Bible John might come after her and her family. She would later take the name of her new partner, Ian McLaughlin. Let's examine the suspects. Peter Sutcliffe, known as the Yorkshire Ripper, was connected to the murders of 13 women and several attempted murders, all in West Yorkshire. While George Puttock believed Sutcliffe was responsible for his wife's death, Sutcliffe wasn't in Scotland when Helen Puttock was killed. Although the methods of killing were similar, police have cleared him of being the Bible John killer due to the lack of evidence. Jean Langford would likely have recognised him from news coverage, and he didn't match the composite sketch either. Then there's psychopath Peter Tobin. Tobin spent 10 years in prison for a violent crime and an indecent attack on 2 girls in 1993. He was released in 2004. However, in 2006 he was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 21 years for the violation and murder of Angelica Cluck in Glasgow. Later, the remains of 2 teenagers who went missing in 1991 were discovered in his old home in Margate, Kent. Tobin was found guilty of murdering Vicky Hamilton in December 2008, which raised its minimum sentence to 30 years. He was also convicted of the murder of Dinah McNichol in December 2009, leading to a whole life order. Looking at his record, it looks possible, does it not? Although all 3 of Tobin's wives have given accounts of being repeatedly imprisoned, throttled, beaten and violated by him, 2 of them would go on record stating that he couldn't be Bible John. His first ex-wife, Margaret Mountney, went on record stating that he couldn't be Bible John, as before Jemima MacDonald was killed, he had relocated from Glasgow to Brighton with her, and she was on honeymoon with him in Brighton, where they were living. They were married there on the 6th of August 1969 and was verified by their marriage certificate. She testified in court that he was still there with her on the 16th. It was also said he was in Brighton at the time of the 3rd murder and had been in police custody at the time of another alleged Bible John murder. His 3rd wife had gone on to say he had shown no interest in religion at all. Tobin had often used a knife to scare his victims, and he had a noticeable scar under his left eye, something a witness would likely have seen during the Bible John murders. But a scar has never been mentioned. It's important to mention that Tobin concealed his victims, but Bible John didn't. Additionally, Jean Langford did not recognise Tobin as the man who had shared the taxi. In 2006, Strathclyde Police formed Operation Anagram, led by Detective Superintendent David Swindle, to investigate all of Tobin's life. Operation Anagram helped piece together a timeline of Tobin's movements and relationships over decades in a bid to determine whether he is responsible for other unsolved crimes. There was no evidence to link Tobin to Bible John, but many still believe he was the man. The long and strange tale of John Irvine McInnes. While trying to discover the name of the person they were going to exhume in a few weeks' time, the investigative reporter Audrey Gillan called at Puttock Marine Police Station and was able to get a look at the Bible John murder wall in the 1990s. If the suspect's name was there to see, she hadn't noticed it. The names on the wall, having been DNA tested, were Mr. McInnes, Mrs. McInnes and Kenneth McInnes. Bible John believed to be buried in a cemetery, it went on. Suspect's profile, a man being tall, light brown hair, affluent family, good education, strict mother, religious upbringing, mummy's boy, relatives in the police, good upbringing, well-spoken and well-dressed. A Scots Guard, known to be irresponsible and bad-tempered, a gambler, thief, divorced, found God, a drink problem, took own life, 30th of the 4th, 1980. The reason for the exhumation was, according to the Crown at the time, that after a DNA profile was obtained from the semen, DNA from family members showed similarities that led the Glasgow Procurator Fiscal to seek a sheriff's approval for the exhumation. On a freezing cold morning of February 1996, the body of John Irvine McInnes, a married former Scots Guard who had taken his own life on the 30th of April 1980, was exhumed to carry out DNA tests. A sample of DNA was taken and tested against DNA from the semen found on the stockings of Helen Puttock. Due to the body's condition, a sample of bone was sent to Erica Hagelberg, who pioneered that a small amount of DNA could be extracted from bones. Up until this time, it could only have been retrieved from soft tissue. Erica Hagelberg was at Cambridge University when the samples arrived. After analysing them, she found the results inconclusive. There were several reasons she couldn't provide a clear yes or no. The DNA samples did not pinpoint him as a suspect. They weren't declaring his innocence, only that the available evidence did not lead to a conclusion. They said, due to the age and bad state of preservation of the biological evidence, particularly the semen stain, we concluded that there is not sufficient evidence from the current DNA information to link John McInnes to the scene of the murder of Helen Puttock. McInnes was cleared of any involvement in the Bible John murders in July 1996 and reinterred. What they discover about John McInnes. McInnes grew up in a religious household where he was introduced to the Plymouth Brethren sect, which disapproved of dancing, drinking and smoking. He chose to use his middle name, Irvine, rather than John. Irvine joined the Scots Guards, but he had a hard time fitting in and was considered somewhat lazy. After leaving the military, he took a job at a furniture store. In 1964 he met Helen Russell and they got married. They welcomed a daughter while living in Ayr. Later, in 1968, they had a son, Kenneth. By 1969 they were living in Stonehouse, and Irvine had begun visiting the Barrowland ballroom. Although many claim that Irvine didn't drink or had never seen him drunk, after Helen Puttock's murder he was arrested twice for being drunk and incapable. He also faced charges for theft, fraud, criminal damage and possession of a knife. In 1971 he checked into a psychiatric hospital after stealing money from the till belonging to his employer. It would appear his wife had had enough and by all accounts took off with the children and divorced Irvine in 1972. His ex-wife claimed it took her many years to get over the trauma he'd caused her in the marriage. Irvine would travel all over the country but always returned to his home in Scotland whenever he found himself in trouble. What prompted the police to look at John Irvine McInnes more seriously in 1996 when he had been more or less dismissed by Jean in an identity parade all those years ago? Jean had said there was a resemblance, but it wasn't him, so what happened? Well, that would be explained later. Sort of. In 1996, a small team of detectives began a reinvestigation into the Bible John cases. In the report, it criticises the original investigation, stating the most damning piece of evidence was a Moylan's ticket that was found at the place where Helen Puttock was killed, but no action was taken regarding this ticket. In fact, they couldn't find any trace of this Moylan's ticket or business card anywhere in the evidence. The detectives eventually discovered that Moylan's was the name of the furniture shop where John Irvine McInnes worked. Was this why he became a suspect? Here's the twist. Retired detective James McInnes, who also worked on the original Helen Puttock case, plays a role in this story. James, also known as Jimmy, is the cousin of Hector McInnes, who is the brother of John Irvine McInnes. In the 1996 report, Hector McInnes angrily wrote to the police, stating the Moylan's ticket never existed. It was made up and couldn't be produced. It was submitted to the Crown by the police. He claimed he knew this because James McInnes had told him. This ticket, or business card, would become important. Why, we ask ourselves? Well, the beginnings and the reopening. With the advancements in DNA, a call was put out by the Forensic Science Laboratory at the Strathclyde Police Headquarters, asking for any cold cases that may be worth reinvestigating. After some time, Detective Chief Inspector Jim McEwen received a report saying they had had a match from the waistband of the tights of Helen Puttock. DCI McEwen set up a review team at Partick Marine Police Station in 1995. Although the team was small, they spent hours going through all the boxes of archived reports. They looked closely at men who had been looked at before, but they felt needed looking at again. The next step was to find them, hopefully still alive, to see if they would consent to give a DNA sample. While going through all of this paperwork, they came across some inconsistencies in an action record. It read that police had gone out to Hamilton to interview a suspect 2 days after Helen was found. This was odd, as no other paperwork could be found. They didn't say who this person was or why they wanted to talk to him. Another record was found that showed the murder team had headed out to Stonehouse, miles away from where Helen Puttock was killed. It wasn't just the police that went, it was the CID big guns themselves. DS Joe Beattie, DS Tom Valentine, DI William Campbell and DI Tommy Grant. Beattie being there that day is very telling. Why were the senior detectives on their way to Stonehouse if it wasn't to charge someone? The team then looked closer into why and discovered that the person, whoever it was taken for some reason to a small police office in Hamilton and kept there. They couldn't understand why this person hadn't been taken straight to Glasgow. Detective Constable Brian Hughes and Willie Lindsay were tasked with talking to a now retired Joe Beattie. A bright but sick Beattie sat up in his hospital bed as he spoke with the two detectives. Sick he may have been, but sharp he still was. He recalled bringing a man out of Stonehouse on a Sunday morning for an identity parade. Jean failed to pick him out, and he was eliminated from further inquiries. This would be discovered to be false because at no time was John McInnes put in front of Jean. It would turn out that 2 other men who worked with McInnes were put in front of Jean, but it wasn't a formal ID parade. Thomas Murphy and Leonard Smith were put in front of Jean and were asked to show their teeth. The night Helen was killed, both Smith and Murphy had been at a furniture show in Glasgow that night, and they had ended up in the Barrowland. They asked Beattie who this man was, but he couldn't remember. He said his name would be in the files in Partick Marine. Hughes and his partner went back to the station, but they still couldn't find anything relating to this man. Going back to Beattie, advised them to go and see his friend Jimmy McInnes. At this interview, Detective Chief Inspector Jim McEwen was asked to sit in on the interview with Jimmy McInnes. As they were both DCIs, although McInnes was now retired, it was a sign of respect in the force. Jimmy McInnes was a tough, short-tempered man who carried himself well. He denied emphatically being involved at all in the inquiry, saying he only answered the phone now and again. They pushed some more, as he felt he was hiding something. They wanted to know who he had gone to see in Stonehouse that day, and they could see McInnes was getting annoyed. He eventually said, "Joe saw my cousin that day, John Irvine McInnes." This is the first time this name is mentioned anywhere in this case. It isn't mentioned in the 1969 reports at all. It was the 1996 Reinvestigation team that brought his name to light. The team learned that on that day, Joe Beattie and the other detectives visited Stonehouse. They went to Sandy McInnes's house, who is Detective Jimmy McInnes's brother. In Sandy's statement, he mentioned that Beattie was searching for John McInnes, the cousin of Sandy and Jimmy McInnes, and that they had found a card from Moylan's furniture store that John worked for. Mickey Moylan, the store owner, confirmed they had business cards. So it seems a card could have indeed been left behind at the crime scene, but the team in 1996 couldn't find any trace of it. However, according to Beattie, in his hospital bed, he had told Brian and Willie on one of their 6 visits that it had possibly been a phone call that had sent them to Stonehouse. There was no mention of the ticket being a reason. It seemed plausible to the team that the Moylan's card had either been lost or, just as likely, removed from evidence. And it also seems that Mickey Moylan wasn't asked about John McInnes at any time in 1969. It was, oddly enough, Beattie who played a key role, along with Jimmy McInnes, despite his intimidations. That led the team to their conclusion. Knowing something is wrong, the team makes a list from 1969 with detectives and witnesses, and a pattern begins to emerge. One woman in 1969, Mrs. Polker, claimed to know the person they wanted to talk to. She'd seen him at the Barrowlands. Was it a coincidence that Jimmy McInnes went to take a statement, but no statement actually appeared? The page was blank, and a poor attempt was made to rub the lady's name out of the files. The statements she had previously made were renumbered in an attempt to hide the gap in the sequence. And was it her phone call that sent the detectives to Stonehouse? We don't know. Another incident would be the taxi driver Alexander Hannah, who turned up at the police station to have it searched for fingerprints on Sunday the 2nd of November 1969, which was led by Jimmy McInnes. The fingerprint analysis came up negative. Shocking, I know. While the taxi was being dusted for said prints, the driver was taken for a drive with McInnes and another officer to trace the journey he had taken that night with Helen, Jean and the man they call Bible John. This was around 2 p.m, the same time Beattie and the other officers were on their way to Stonehouse, and Jean was just about to do her first ID parade. This is also odd, as Alexander Hannah was never asked to do an ID parade to see if he could identify the man. If something is not in the action book, then it would show up in the parade book. Every person who attends an ID parade is recorded. Name, age, address, height, hair colour, eye colour, a full description. John Irving McInnes was not in it. In the Puttock case, the name John Irvine McInnes was never mentioned. The officers at the time were unfamiliar with him, and when the 1996 team inquired about him to those who had worked on the case in 1969, they were met with blank stares. It seems that someone deliberately removed his name from the case. If there was a cover-up, what was the reason behind it? I want to mention that when Brian and Willie last visited Joe Beattie to share what they had discovered, they asked him if he had helped cover for John Irving McInnes. According to the former detectives, Beattie shook his head and began to cry. This clearly distressed him. They could see his pain and decided to leave. However, former officers who worked with both Beattie and Jimmy McInnes later stated that both men would never have covered for anyone. Joe Beattie passed away on the 10th of February 2000. The 1996 team decided to organise their own ID parade. They reviewed leads that the 1969 team hadn't pursued and used photos to create a lineup. Among these was a picture of John McInnes from his arrest for fraud, sourced from the Scottish Criminal Records Office. They combined this with other black and white photos of men who looked similar. They then took the folder filled with 12 photos to the taxi driver Alexander Hannah and asked him if he could pick out the man from the taxi. He looked and picked out McInnes straight away, saying, "That's him there, but that's an older picture of him." And it was, as the photo was taken a while after Helen Puttock's murder, so Hannah was clarifying he hadn't forgotten the man who was in the taxi that night. They then visited one of the bouncers who was involved in the altercation that night at the Barrowlands and asked if he would be able to pick out the guy from that night. He replied, "Show me." And straight away he picked out McInnes. This was evidence indeed. This was the man they believed was in the taxi that night. And the Procurator Fiscal agreed. He told them that if McInnes had been alive, he'd have issued a warrant for his arrest. But Jean wasn't so sure. She claimed, There's wee different things. I just don't feel it in there that it's him. There is a resemblance, but I've seen millions of resemblances. Jean denies the allegations that they were drunk and acting like good time girls. She explains that both she and her sister couldn't afford to drink and were just looking to enjoy some dancing. She made it clear her sister did not sleep around. She wasn't like that. She also states she knew Helen and George were having problems, but that was their business. She went on to say that Joe Beatty helped her change her name, as he knew how scared she was of repercussions. As she went into her story more, she would tell how the Castlemilk John had told her to be more careful of the other John, as he thought he might be a cop. She didn't know why he thought that, but he said he didn't like him. What occurred after leaving the ballroom had been told so many times. Through all this time, Jean was left terrified and vulnerable. She goes on to say she had a good, clear look at the man in the taxi. But the police were convinced that the man in the taxi was the man the world had named Bible John, and the exhumation was hiding an even bigger story. But was he? Was he the man that killed Helen? And could they prove it? They had no evidence, but plenty of doubts set in as they investigated further. Due to the lack of investigation into Helen Puttock's husband George in 1969, the 1996 team sent an officer to his home to get DNA and dental impressions from him. He was shocked at the time, and I have to say, even though they were having marital problems and some DV had been reported early on and not followed up, there is no evidence at all that George Puttock had anything to do with his wife's murder, and both the DNA and dental samples came back negative, so he could now be properly ruled out. After Helen's death, George returned to Wokingham with his 2 children and later remarried. He chose not to tell his children that their mother had been murdered, instead claiming she had been hit by a bus. The youngest child, Michael, died in 2020. He had not spoken to his father for 20 years after discovering the truth about his mother's death. George Puttock passed away on the 20th of November 2022. John Templeton. In 2024, author Jill Bavin-Mizzi claims to have found enough evidence to suggest that Templeton might be Bible John. She apparently researched the McInnes family history and noted the name John Templeton appears among the ancestors of Hector and Janet McInnes' siblings, whose DNA samples showed patterns similar to the DNA found in the semen stains on Helen's stockings. Templeton's age, height and hair colouring fits the description of the suspect. He was also definitely a foster child, as police suspected the killer was. She says Templeton was questioned by police 6 months after Helen Puttock's murder, but he was not re-interviewed, as confirmed by his ex-wife. He also did not take part in an identity parade. Templeton worked as a printer and later became a composer or typesetter after his apprenticeship. He was tall, had sandy hair and matched the age description given by Jean. There were suggestions he may have had an overlapping tooth. He married in August 1969 and settled in North Kelvinside, Glasgow. But he and his wife separated in 1974. When asked about the claims linking him to the case, his ex-wife expressed shock. John Templeton passed away in 2015 at the age of 70. There were other loose ends, apparently. A taxi driver named William MacDonald reported seeing a woman in an ocelot coat running down South Street at 1 a.m. There was no further investigation into this sighting. If the woman was Helen, it raises questions about where she was headed and why she didn't go home. Joe Beatty said he knew nothing about this incident. Later, Joe Beatty was asked why the investigation wasn't handled properly. He suggested that some officers had doubts about Helen Puttock's character, which may have affected their commitment to the case. Their words, not mine, and an unfortunate sign of the time. After the body was exhumed, there were calls for an apology. The Lord Advocate looked into the situation and decided that no further steps were needed. This case involved not only the murder of Helen Puttock, but also Joe Beatty's management of the inquiry. The investigation had been abruptly halted, leaving the officers in the 1996 as to the reason why. The only explanation they could come up with was that someone might have been worried about a potential cover-up. In later years, a forensic artist recreated the image to highlight the teeth of the man known as Bible John, since the original picture didn't include the important detail. The high-profile investigation into the murders was one of the biggest ever staged in Scotland. But despite a manhunt that saw police interview more than 7,000 people and take 4,000 statements, no arrests were ever made. Occasionally, interest in Bible John resurfaces, but the unresolved nature of the case continues to frustrate everyone involved. Thank you for watching.
Is it really the case that the man that you are searching for as the killer could strike again?
There's a possibility he may, yes.